We're going to find out what does it mean to actually work as a pro coder with open source, with OSS based software. I mean, what are we talking about here? I don't mean consuming OSS products. A lot of tools that we use, commercial or open source, what have you, underneath them, there may be OSS products, but I'm talking about being a contributor, developing, coding against open source products. What does that really mean? Maybe you've heard from people saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to work in open source? Or we've heard this kind of secondhand information, or from somebody else. It's like, I don't want to work on closed source stuff. I want to work on open source. What does that mean? I mean, what's the impact of that kind of thing? What's in store for you if you want to be a pro coder and operate that way? And that's why I want to clear up any misunderstandings of what is the real reality check out there. And have you actually talked to somebody that's working full-time or even part-time on an open source toolkit? Have you actually gotten the feedback, or are you running on, are you basing your information on somebody else? Are you basing your perception of open source on somebody else's misperception of open source? That's what we're here to talk about today. Now, before you get going, I want to remind you that, I don't want to hit that one. I want to hit this one. If you're watching this on the video, you can also catch it on the audio platform. I've got, every time I run an episode of the Pro Coder Show, I pull it down afterwards and throw it up onto our podcasting platform. So you can go to podcast.procoder.io and subscribe and catch it there. And some of the stuff can be a little bit deep, and it doesn't hurt to go back and listen to it a second time. All right. So what is open source? First of all, let's get some terminology in place. I mean, that's the first critical thing, is what is open source? It means you have access to the source code. You can read the original code that went into whatever this toolkit is, or this product, or what have you. I had a text message there. I was trying to see if that was something critical. Okay. So you're checking, so you're monitoring, you're using software that you can see what the original source was. That's what open source means. Now, the implications of that are different to different people. For example, there was a group of people that are like, well, we need open source above all, whereas there's other people that had the free software movement, or the FSF, Richard Stallman. And his idea was he wanted to be able to, he had worked, I think, at MIT Labs at one point in time, and he had a hard time working with a printer on the machine that he was on, if I remember the story correctly, because the printer driver was proprietary, and he couldn't affect change with the printer that was sitting in his department because of this. And so his goal with open source and what have you was to actually develop free software. In fact, but other people were like, well, I can't build patches. I can't develop stuff. I can't make alterations that serve my customers or my own needs unless I have access to the source code. So, it may be best to actually go out and look at what have people actually done in the world of open source to better understand what's going on. One of the things I like to look back at time when I talk about open source is Spring. Okay, Spring's a good example of a open source toolkit that started open source and has remained open source to this day, and has just recently celebrated its 20th birthday. That arose as the software in a book that Rod Johnson wrote, where he was challenging some of the assumptions and some of the driving things going into what was the Java 2 Enterprise Edition version of Java, what was called Enterprise Java, or as we said back in the day, J2EE. It seemed like Java at the time, being a spec-driven language, there's a specification for the Java language and every feature in it, and there seemed to be some stickiness to that, some element of stuffiness, and it seemed as if not everything coming out of Java at that time was ideal. Part of this is Rod Johnson was a consultant. He worked for shops. He was very familiar with enterprise Java and how it worked, and he knew some of the hiccups he ran into working with it, trying to serve his customers. So he started having a new approach to things, a new idea on how to do stuff. And so he started noodling out ideas, and that ended up becoming a book. Now, what had happened was some other key people of the Java community read his book, and they banded together to form a company around it. Now, at the time, I believe it was Rod Johnson's consulting company was known as Interface 21. So I think they used an existing company. I'm not 100% certain on the corporate structure back in the time, but it's not critical for what we're talking about today. But what they wanted to do was take the code that he kind of alluded to in the book and turn it into a real world toolkit. So at the time, they they didn't have GitHub then, so they hosted their stuff at SourceForge. Now, smash like if you even remember what SourceForge was when it comes to toolkits. There was a lot of code over there back in the day. I think it still exists, but I don't know if people are even using SourceForge today. I wouldn't be surprised if there's very little. So anyway, this was somebody that was trying to launch a company, form a business, work with multiple people, and earn their daily keep with an open source framework. So that gives us kind of a definitional basis for what we're talking about. And let me tell you how they operated. One thing is you can go find interviews with people like Keith Donald from years ago, where he talks about what the early days it was like back then. So they weren't selling a product. Okay. You think about other tools that you're using that you pay for, whether it's a machine or, gear, like, I have a microphone here that I paid for, but we buy software products. They were not selling the product. Okay. So they couldn't make money at that. So what did they do? They made money doing consulting services. Rod was already familiar with doing consulting work because that's what he was doing. So he would go on site and build apps for people. I think Colin was one of the other founders, Keith Donald, Jurgen. They would go to different companies and write code for them during the day. When you're writing code for somebody else, does that mean you can sit there and work on your own toolkit at the same time? No, you can't do that. You need to be writing their software. But what they were trying to do was leverage their toolkit in the process. So in the beginning, they'd do consulting. They would go build apps for other people all day. Then they would go back to their hotel room that night and work on the Spring Framework toolkit in their hotel room at night. I don't know how long they would operate. They probably varied. They probably worked a lot of hours. Now you can say yay or nay to that kind of stuff, but that's how it started in the beginning. And part of the idea is if you're using something that's open source, something with a license that lets you leverage it, it can be that it's like, hey, I solved this problem today. Let's pick an example problem, something I'm very familiar with. One of the first things that drew me into Spring back in the day was JDBC template. This was a utility class that simplified JDBC operations. People like to harangue on Java for some of its stodginess, but the dance you did to talk to a relational database is kind of the same everywhere. You had to open a connection, create a cursor, submit your query. You got back a result set. You had to iterate over the result set. Then you needed to close the cursor in the connection. And sometimes people would stumble over that. So there's a lot of song and dance to interacting with a relational database. And basically, JDBC just encapsulated that in a standard API. A lot of times what we think about when we're doing a relational database query is I'm going to submit a SQL statement and I want to iterate over the results. That's all we're thinking about. That is all we're wanting to do. And so some of this extra dance is very easy to get annoyed by, to overlook, to miss some key steps. And this is where JDBC template came in. It basically encapsulated that same workflow that I just described and made it where, okay, here's the SQL statement and here's the processor. Now, either I'm going to process the entire result set myself, or I know that every row is the same thing, so I'm going to provide what's called a row mapper. And JDBC template can do the rest. If I give it the configuration settings to connect to the database, it can do all the opening and closing, all the resource management, if you will. And I'm going to provide it the key business stuff, the query and the processor. And so that's the kind of thing where, hey, go solve that one time. Go fix that one time in your hotel room at night. Take it in the next day and leverage it in that snapshot release. If you're using snapshots with that particular customer, you can leverage that. And the thing is then the next customer I go to, it's going to be available there. And the next customer after that, and after that, and after that. And every customer you go to, now I can use this JDBC template. This is where the magic of open source is. Not a proprietary product. I don't need to go sell it to 10 customers in a row. Well, you've got to convince them to use it 10 times, all 10 customers that you're going to. But it's not as big of a hurdle as I got to sell it and convince them to write me a check every time. That's a different gambit. And so that's what they did. That's what they were doing in the early days. They would go on site, they would solve problems, and then they would take the feedback from that and say, is there something here in the solution that I can fold back into the toolkit that makes it simpler for me? Can I distill away the clunky aspects that shouldn't be there, the infrastructure wiring or the injection of stuff? Can I make that the toolkit aspect so that I'm focusing on the business part? I'm focusing on the value that I'm making. You take the feedback, you update the toolkit, you then leverage it, and it creates this feedback loop. And now we're no longer talking about, I don't know, people, I like to say sitting around in a committee meeting and making decisions, but this is e-committee. So on email threads or bulletin boards, whatever, discussing with other committee members, well, I think we should do this, or I think we should do that. You're taking feedback from actual on-site customers and codifying it into a toolkit and then reusing it. That's some of the best feedback I can imagine. And so that's what they did. They did that for years, and they built up enough clientele, enough business, enough action, if you will, that they reached a point that Jurgen was actually able to work full time on the framework and not have to go on site and do consulting. Josh Long on his personal channel is at Coffee and Software, Code and Coffee. Code and Coffee was recently interviewed Jurgen and Rod to kind of celebrate the 20th birthday of Spring. And that was one of the things that Rod mentioned during that was they reached a point between their consulting and also they started selling training. I think Keith Donald called the training their first $1 million business. And you remember he likens it to when the check came in and he was basically the business manager in the United States territory. He had to go down to his personal bank and deposit $1 million check. That's a fun story. But they had to do this bit where they did training, they did consulting, and they pulled in enough revenue that they could fund Jurgen's paycheck such that he could work full time on the framework and essentially cover that. And that took a load off the other consultants. And they were able to start growing in that respect. And so when you sit there and say, I want to write OSS, well, what do you mean? But what do you think you want to do when you want to build OSS stuff? Are you going to run your own company? Are you going to go out and work like that paradigm? If not, what is your plan? Maybe you haven't thought that far ahead and you're just, well, I don't know. Somebody said it's a cool idea. I should try it out. Well, there's another factor in all this stuff when we talk about OSS, and it's the fact that most OSS development is being funded by corporations. And we also have this romanticized idea that OSS is something I'm going to build it in my spare time and I'm going to make all the decisions. I'm going to choose what goes into it. And somehow magically 5 to 10 years from now, I'm going to be a millionaire because of it. That's a little thin on detail. It's like, what's your game plan for getting from here to there? To be honest, the corporations that are funding open source development, they're coming out and saying they want open source. I think sometimes they don't have all the answers in place. They haven't thought it through. And this is definitely evidenced by some of the changes in the market where there's different middlewares, whether it's a database, a message broker, what have you, that come out with an open source licensed option. People are deploying to the cloud. They're using the middleware on the cloud, and then another vendor who operates on the cloud is basically implementing their protocol, or they're taking their open source product, they're encapsulating it in a paid for product, and then they're reselling it and they're making the money off of it. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that healthy competition, or is that sharky behavior? You got to think about that. So those are different angles to the whole stuff about what do you do in that context. Some of the companies, the vendors, the middleware providers, what have you, are trying to deal with that. And so they come out with updated license policies. Like, wait a second, wait a minute. The GPL license that we released with doesn't really talk about that. The GPL license was written before the cloud era came to be, or we use Apache server license. Apache server license definitely doesn't talk about that scenario where somebody takes your ASL wrap thing and they wrap it and they resell your product. As far as I know from that license agreement, that's totally cool. Is it? This is the stuff where, companies have been formed, people hired, funding has been raised to go to market to try to build something. And underneath it, somewhere in the foundation, is an open source toolkit. And you're wanting to go join the team. Does your company that you're working for building open source like that, do they have a clear handle on what the game plan is, how they're going to make it to going to IPO or what have you, reaching liquidity? That's a challenge. So some of the stuff I've also seen is that, there's friends of mine that have worked in certain toolkits for 12 years or more. They've picked up certain things with a passion and they have developed it. And some of them, they're working in their spare time. It's not heavily monetized. They may get donations. There's new support on platforms like GitHub and other places where you can actually go in and say, I use that toolkit. I'm willing to donate $10 a month. Are you willing to work on a toolkit with such passion that you don't want to deal with VCs, with venture capitalists? You don't want to deal with this corporate stuff. You're willing to let the user community come to you and support you, potentially at $5 or $10 a month per person. Try to think about, but you have family, you're trying to put food on the table. Is that enough to do that? Or do you need to work professionally as a pro coder at another outfit so that you can support doing this toolkit? I mean, this is what I talk about, thinking it through. I want to put all these ideas in your mind so you can sit there and size it up, and you can sit there and say, well, gee, I didn't even think about that. There's a lot to consider. And, this is just one of the many things that if you're going to be a pro coder, I want you to have all the information. I want you to know, what are all the long and the short, the pros and the cons of all this stuff. And that's also why I wrote 12 Rules for Pro Coders. It's actually out now. You can go grab it. It's available at Amazon. I'm releasing it in other places as well. You can go get the paperback cover. But the cheapest place to buy that is at 12rules.io, 12rules.io. We've got it there, and you can get the ebook today. I'm also working on the audio and video version, and those are still being sold at discount price if you want to check that out. Now, I want to thank you very much for turning up for today's episode of the Pro Co Shoulder. I can't even talk straight. Of the Pro Coder Show, all right? So, above all, I want you to go out there and be professional.
This episode is over, but your code writing journey continues. Visit procoder.io to find links and resources to help you become a pro coder.